The Asia-Pacific region has long benefited from pro-growth policies, foreign investment, and a strong labor force. Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, but the gains have come at a cost, especially for human rights. In some countries, economic growth has been accompanied by significant human rights abuses by business operations. In the past, responsibility for addressing human rights abuses by business operations has been the subject of fierce debates. All that changed in 2011 with the introduction of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that were unanimously adopted by the Human Rights Council. The Guiding Principles provide a framework to address and improve human rights standards in the business sector. They define the state's duty to protect human rights in business operations, a business's responsibility to respect human rights, and for both to provide remedies for when violations occur. The Guiding Principles provide a way for businesses to contribute to the 2030 Agenda and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. For example, anti-discrimination policies at the workplace that boost gender equality and empower women in support of SDG 5. Monitoring and auditing of supply chains to eradicate forced labor. As a result, businesses create good work opportunities and support economic growth in support of SDG 8. As businesses set up grievance mechanisms and complaint systems to respect rights, they prevent disputes from turning into crises and conflicts, contributing to SDG 16. UNDP is focused on promoting the UN's guiding principles by providing technical advice to governments, developing policies, due diligence processes and remedies for businesses, and supporting civil society organizations and human rights defenders to improve accountability. UNDP is strengthening both businesses and human rights to promote a sustainable future.
Afternoon everyone. Selamat siang Ibu dan Bapak yang terhormat. I am Sagita Adesiwi, Business and Human Rights Specialist dari UNDP Indonesia that will be the host for today. I would like to inform a few housekeeping notes. We have interpreters available in Bahasa Indonesia and English that could be accessed at the bottom of your screen. We are also kindly requesting for everyone to fill in the attendance list on the link that will be shared in the chat box. Thank you. Selamat siang Bapak dan Ibu yang terhormat. Sebelum memulai, saya ingin memberitahukan bahwa kegiatan kita hari ini disediakan juga interpreter dalam bahasa Indonesia dan bahasa Inggris yang dapat diakses di layar Anda. Kami juga memohon untuk Bapak dan Ibu mengisi attendance list yang akan di-share di chat box. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. A very warm welcome to our respected guests, speakers, panelists, and all participants to the dialogue on preparing for mandatory human rights due diligence to achieve sustainable development goals. Thank you for being with us here today. We would like to extend our special gratitude to Excellency Ibu Marina Berg, Swedish Ambassador to Indonesia, Ibu Hajarati, Director of Human Rights Cooperation, Ministry of Law and Human Rights, Bapak Norimasa Shimomura, UNDP Indonesia Resident Representative, Bapak Marzuki Darusman, Chair of FIRST, Bapak Profesor Makarim Wibisono, Co-founder of FIRST, and to all of our panelists of representatives from countries and companies who have spared their time to be with us today. This event today is part of the Business and Human Rights in Asia program organized by UNDP and FIRST, supported by the government of Sweden and the European Union. UNDP has continued to promote the implementation of the United Nations Guiding Principles, working together with government, private sectors, and also civil societies for collective action through the Business and Human Rights in Asia programs. Today's dialogue is aimed to further raise awareness among business sectors on how to promote and respect human rights within business operation, as well as provide insight to government and the invited countries' representative on both mandatory and voluntary human rights due diligence and how all of these efforts could contribute to SDGs. Without further ado, now let us hear welcome remarks from Bapak Norimasa Simomura, the resident representative of UNDP Indonesia, to open today's dialogue. Pak Nori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sagita. Her Excellency Marina Berg, Ambassador of Sweden to Indonesia, Ibu Hajarati, Director of Human Rights Cooperation at the Ministry of Law and Human Rights, Bapak Marzuki Darusman, Chair of the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards, Bapak Makarim Wibisono, Co-founder of Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for this very important dialogue on mandatory human rights due diligence to achieving sustainable development goals. For the business to be competitive in today's market, it is not enough to offer goods and services at a cheap price. Even ensuring good quality may not be enough. States regulators and better educated consumers in Indonesia and around the world will increasingly demand for goods and services that are produced ethically with due respect to human rights, not based on labor exploitation or abuses. Otherwise, companies may face serious reputational risks and soon lose their market. This is in essence what the United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights try to address, and UNDP has been promoting them in cooperation with the governments across Asia. Through our partnership with the government of Sweden and the European Union, we are supporting the uptake of the business and human rights agenda here in Indonesia, as well as in Bangladesh, India, Malaysia, Mongolia, Thailand, and Vietnam, among others. The UN's guiding principles call for businesses to respect human rights and require that they exercise due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address the impact on human rights. These guidelines aim to ensure that no child is forced into hard labor, no woman and man ever loses their dignity in performing their manual work. Despite the huge challenge created by the COVID-19 pandemic, it has also provided an opportunity to rethink our interactions. A key element to this process is to reinvent how we conduct business in a manner that better aligns with the values and principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. Personally, I see these guidelines as a much needed tool to provide a voice for the voiceless. I'm talking about the millions of workers and laborers across the globe who have suffered abuses, discrimination, and unfair treatment without proper means for redress. Indonesia has already taken a crucial step towards promoting human rights in business. Last November, the government launched a consultation process to develop a national strategy on business and human rights. On the same day, it also launched an online due diligence tool called Prisma, designed to help businesses to carry out self-assessments as they attempt to maintain human rights principles in their work. It also helps to analyze the potential risks of human rights abuses in their operations. The pandemic has worsened inequality in our society, pushing many people into poverty and left millions more vulnerable to human rights abuses. As we work to build forward better, to bring the country back on track with the SDG agenda, governments and international community need to work much closer with the private sector and help just markets that provides access only to those companies that meet the union's highest standard. Understanding the mandatory human rights legislation may give us a better indication of the direction.
And as many of you know, Sweden has for long promoted sustainable human rights practices in the private on encouraging due diligence and advocating for responsible business practice. Let me start off by giving you my 3 main reasons for why I'm so happy to address you today. Firstly, human rights are central to Swedish foreign policy, and Sweden aspires to be a clear voice for human rights around the world, not just in words, but also in actions. Secondly, we firmly believe that businesses can be and are agents.
Jadi alasan penting bagi saya adalah hak asasi manusia merupakan.
Thirdly, those businesses that do not realize this, who do not keep up with the winds of change, will sooner or later go out of business. I'm convinced that the successful companies of tomorrow will be those who make sustainability part of their core business. Sweden is, of course, not by no means alone realizing this. Since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011, there has been global undertaking to promote respect for human rights within businesses. These guiding principles are now central to Swedish policy, and we expect business and human rights to develop and to be interdependent. The role of the private sector in promoting corporate responsibility, CSR, is an integral part of the whole 2030 agenda. In 2015, Sweden was one of the first countries in the world to adopt a national action plan for business and human rights, in line with the UN Guiding Principles. The Swedish government thereby signaled a clear expectations for Swedish companies to act responsibly by respecting human rights in all of their operations, in Sweden and elsewhere, in all other countries that they invest in. This is a commitment shared by the whole of Europe, as is evident by the participation here today by my European colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, my embassy here in Jakarta has a clear primary objective of promoting trade and investment between our 2 countries, Indonesia and Sweden. And we are supporting Swedish companies in establishing themselves on the Indonesian market. But as ambassador of Sweden, I also represent a much wider Swedish engagement in Indonesia. Today, it is manifested in the form of our Regional Development Cooperation in Asia, run by the Swedish Embassy in Bangkok, and also through our core support to UNDP. These engagements have together resulted in Business and Human Rights Asia program, which spans across several Asian countries, as was mentioned, and the webinar here today. This is part of the Swedish pursuit of more responsible and sustainable business practices around the world. It makes me so proud to represent that pursuit here today. Just as the private sector and CSR is integral to the 2030 agenda, so are human rights to our work with trade, investment, and export promotion. All our efforts within these fields are geared towards the same end: sustainable development. This is also why last year Sweden and Indonesia celebrated this is also reason why during the celebration of the 70 years of diplomatic relation between Sweden and Indonesia, we launched Sweden-Indonesia Sustainable Partnership. The business and the human rights program sits very well with the ambitions of that partnership. It is my sincere hope that the implementation of the respect of human rights will be an integral part of strengthening our relations between our 2 countries, as well as increasing Indonesia's overall economic growth and competitiveness. I'm proud that our program, Business and Human Rights Asia, has been supporting the government of Indonesia in formulating national strategy on business and human rights. Within that support, I understand that the program works closely with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights as the national focal point for business and human rights, and several other relevant ministries. Just the fact that this issue spans across many ministries shows its importance and impact. And I'm encouraged by the fact that the Indonesian government treats it as such. It is indeed high time to do so. Just as international businesses put an ever-increasing emphasis on human rights and sustainable development, so do investors. Indonesia is not alone in pursuing a national strategy on business and human rights, and I believe that the regional competition for attracting sustainable businesses and investments will be stronger and stronger. Also, one should not underestimate the power of good and the value of a brand. Today's consumers are highly demanding, and they will continue to be more demanding. Companies that do not adhere this permanent trend will soon face challenges in retaining customers. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on a final note, but perhaps the most important one, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact all aspects of our lives, and it has had devastating effects on the economies. This amplifies the need to sensitize the business community on the human rights. Many companies have contributed by providing medical supplies and rapid relief to communities in need. However, leading companies also know that they must go beyond this to address any negative impacts they may have on society and the environment related to the current crisis. It is imperative that corporations take the first step to ensure that they have sound policies in place, to ensure that the human rights of all individuals involved in their business, from suppliers to end retailers, are treated fairly and are free of abuse of any kind. These companies understand that demonstrating respect for human rights, especially in the midst of harsh economic circumstances, is a strong reflection of their core values. How businesses respond to the crisis will shape public attitudes towards the private sector for years to come. Now is the time to rethink development and in building back better from the pandemic. We must seize this opportunity to integrate business and human rights into our vision of a new world post-pandemic. One that places human rights at the heart of our actions to achieve the sustainable development goals. Thank you to UNDP and the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards for organizing this very important and timely event. And thank you to the representatives from embassies and businesses who will share their experiences and reflections. I wish you a successful, rewarding, and action-oriented dialogue. I look forward to many more to come and to see the concrete results they will have. Thank you very much. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, The Excellency Ibu Marina Berg, for the strong and wonderful key remarks, and also for the support to our programs. Thank you. And now we will invite Bapak Marzuki Darusman, the Chair of FIRST, to deliver key remarks on trend of business and human rights in Indonesia and beyond. FIRST has been consistently working together with the government and private sectors to promote business and human rights in Indonesia. In 2019, FIRST published a study that assessed and ranked respect for human rights commitment and performance within 100 largest public companies in Indonesia. Pak Marzuki, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Sagita, and good afternoon, Excellencies, to all of us. In behalf of the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards, in collaboration with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, we are pleased to welcome you to a dialogue that brings together representatives of governments and businesses to share their thoughts on the progress of mandatory human rights due diligence, HRDD, around the world. I would like to express my sincere appreciation at the outset to Mr. Norimasa Shimomura, the resident representative of UNDP Indonesia, Madam Marina Berg, Swedish ambassador to Indonesia, Bapak Mualimin Abdi, in this case represented by Ibu Hajriati, Pak Makarim Wibisono, who is the co-founder of FIRST, and not least Pak Ciprianus and Pak Bahtiar, who will be moderating the sessions, for taking the time and effort to share their remarks in our dialogue today. I would like to thank the speakers also from the Embassy of France in Jakarta, Embassy of Switzerland in Indonesia, Royal Norwegian Embassy in Jakarta, and representatives from the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, the ECCG, based in Brussels, for joining us today. We look forward to your sharing the progress of mandatory human rights due diligence in your respective countries and in the European Union. I would like to also thank representatives from global and national companies who will be speaking at the second session of today's dialogue. We believe that the progress and efforts that your company has taken in ensuring human rights are respected across your company operation will encourage the participants, particularly from the private sector, to start embracing respect for human rights in their workplace. FIRST believes that dialogue and discussion on business and human rights in general, and HRDD in particular, needs to be intensified. This is due to the fact that UNGPs, which have been adopted for almost a decade, have not been widely implemented by companies around the world, particularly in Indonesia. The corporate social responsibility era, the CSR, may be passing and becoming a thing of the past. Companies now are embracing responsibility to respect human rights in accordance with the UNGPs. We are fast going into the BHR era. The focus of business has now shifted from shareholders to stakeholders. The study that FIRST conducted in 2019, that both Mr. Nomimura and Madame Berg had mentioned earlier, that assessed the implementation of respect for human rights in 100 largest public companies in Indonesia, uncovered just 4 that had reported their
Dan kami
commitment.
temukan bahwa ada 4 perusahaan yang telah melaporkan komitmennya untuk menegakkan HAM dengan mengacu pada UNGP, sedangkan hanya 3 perusahaan yang telah menyatakan komitmen mereka untuk melakukan uji tuntas hak asasi manusia, seperti yang disampaikan oleh Bapak Norimasa Simomura. Jadi ada banyak PR yang perlu kita lakukan ke depannya. Dan
through legislation that businesses respect human rights in their operations. In addition, investors and customers, not to mention the consumers, are also demanding that businesses respect human rights, and there are increasing studies that show the ability of a corporation to attract capital from investors is greatly influenced by how effectively the corporation is seen to be managing its human rights risks. However, this trend should not be perceived as a burden, but rather an opportunity. To today's dialogue is aimed to encourage new legal requirements. I thank Mr. Norimasa Shimomura and Mrs. Marina Berg once again, and may I wish you all a fruitful dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marzuki, for the key remarks. On this special session, Ibu Hajarati, the Director of Human Rights Cooperation, Ministry of Law and Human Rights, will explain human rights due diligence within Indonesia's national strategy on business and human rights. We are very pleased to see Indonesia's commitment to business and human rights, and more so, UNDP Indonesia has worked closely with the Ministry, supporting the development of the national strategy. Selamat siang, Ibu Hajarati.
Good afternoon, Ibu Hajarati.
Waktu dan tempatnya kami persilakan.
The floor is yours, Ibu. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Kameranya sepertinya belum on, Ibu.
Ibu, it seems that your camera is still off. Probably the host can help me to turn on my camera.
Terima kasih, Mbak Sagita.
Thank you very much, Ibu Sagita.
Ya, dengan tidak mengurangi rasa hormat kami sampaikan permohonan maaf dari Bapak Direktur Jenderal Hak Asasi Manusia, karena beliau pada hari ini juga di jam yang sama ada kegiatan yang tidak bisa ditinggalkan oleh beliau, sehingga beliau mewakilkan kepada saya untuk membacakan sambutan pada kegiatan di sore hari ini. Yang saya hormati Bapak Marzuki Darusman, Ketua Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standard, kemudian Prof. Makarim Wibisono, Co-Founders First, Ibu Marina Berg, Duta Besar Swedia untuk Indonesia, Bapak Norimasa Simomura, perwakilan UNDP Indonesia, dan para peserta webinar atau diskusi hari ini. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Pertama-tama, marilah kita panjatkan puji syukur kehadirat Tuhan Yang Maha Esa, karena pada sore hari ini kegiatan yang bertajuk persiapan menuju uji tuntas bisnis dan HAM untuk pencapaian tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan yang diselenggarakan oleh FIRST, sungguh suatu yang berbahagia kita masih dapat melakukannya sampai dalam keadaan sehat walafiat. Bapak Ibu sekalian, bisnis dan HAM telah berkembang secara global sejak disepakatinya UN.
Business and human rights have developed globally since the adoptions of UN guiding principles.
Protect, Respect and Remedy Framework pada tahun 2011. Indonesia telah menyatakan dukungan dan komitmennya untuk mengimplementasikan prinsip-prinsip UNGP tersebut dan secara dinamis diwujudkan dalam bentuk regulasi di beberapa kementerian teknis. Kementerian Hukum dan HAM sendiri telah ditunjuk sebagai National Focal Point Bisnis dan HAM di Indonesia. Kementerian Hukum dan HAM merupakan kementerian yang memiliki tugas dan fungsi perumusan, formulasi, koordinasi, konsultasi, dan supervisi di bidang hak asasi manusia, sehingga diharapkan dapat menjangkau seluruh pemangku kepentingan terkait yang memiliki perhatian terhadap bisnis dan HAM di Indonesia. National Focal Point memainkan peranan penting sebagai perpanjang tangan pemerintah dalam mengkoordinasikan berbagai upaya dalam pengarusutamaan bisnis dan HAM di Indonesia, mulai dari peningkatan pemahaman bisnis dan HAM, pembentukan gugus tugas atau kelompok kerja bisnis dan HAM, hingga penyusunan rencana aksi nasional atau peta jalan atau strategi nasional bisnis dan HAM di Indonesia. Selanjutnya, National Focal Point juga akan terus berupaya untuk mempromosikan UNGPs baik kepada pemerintah pusat maupun pemerintah daerah. Sebagaimana terdapat pada UNGPs, baik negara maupun perusahaan memiliki peran yang harus dilaksanakan dalam memastikan bahwa para korban pelanggaran HAM terkait dengan bisnis memiliki akses ke pemulihan yang efektif. Pelaksanaan uji tuntas hak asasi manusia sebaiknya dimulai sedini mungkin dalam perkembangan aktivitas atau perusahaan. Maksudnya perkembangan aktivitas suatu perusahaan. Melakukan uji tuntas HAM dapat membantu perusahaan untuk menunjukkan bahwa perusahaan telah melakukan langkah yang layak dalam melindungi hak asasi manusia pihak-pihak terkait pada aktivitas bisnisnya. Saat ini Kementerian Hukum dan HAM, dalam hal ini Direktorat Jenderal Hak Asasi Manusia, tengah mengembangkan penilaian risiko hak asasi manusia atau PRISMA. PRISMA adalah suatu program aplikatif mandiri yang diperuntukkan untuk membantu perusahaan untuk menganalisa risiko pelanggaran hak asasi manusia yang disebabkan oleh kegiatan bisnis. Aplikasi ini mempunyai tujuan untuk memfasilitasi semua perusahaan di semua sektor bisnis, baik besar maupun kecil, untuk melakukan stress assessment dengan memetakan kondisi real atas dampak potensi atau resiko, kemudian menetapkan rencana tindak lanjut dari hasil penilaian, melacak pengimplementasian tindakan lanjutan tersebut, serta mengkomunikasikan rangkaian ini pada publik. Upaya penyusunan PRISMA diambil sebagai pengisian kekosongan atas keperluan alat ukur bisnis dan HAM yang aplikatif di Indonesia dalam melakukan uji tuntas atau due diligence. Oleh karena itu, PRISMA akan menyediakan seperangkat indikator bagi sektor swasta maupun BUMN untuk menilai dampak aktivitas operasional bisnisnya terhadap hak asasi manusia. PRISMA sendiri dapat diakses pada prismaham.id. Prinsip-prinsip yang terdapat pada PRISMA ialah sebagai berikut. PRISMA bersifat mandiri, di mana perusahaan dapat mengisi secara mandiri dan bebas. PRISMA bersifat tanpa diskriminasi, di mana PRISMA dapat digunakan oleh semua perusahaan, baik besar maupun kecil di segala sektor bisnis. PRISMA juga bersifat sukarela, namun sangat disarankan perusahaan dan rantai pasoknya dapat menggunakannya. PRISMA bersifat edukatif bagi semua sektor bisnis untuk mendalami UNGPs dan isu-isu terkait bisnis dan HAM. Karena bersifat edukatif, tidak ada sanksi ketika perusahaan tidak melakukannya atau memperoleh nilai rendah. PRISMA bersifat regular, artinya penilaian dilakukan setiap tahun sehingga dapat dimonitor kesinambungan dan peningkatan hak asasi manusianya oleh perusahaan. Dan penyusunan PRISMA didasarkan pada prinsip-prinsip yang berlaku dalam UNGPs, instrumen hak asasi manusia lainnya, dan perundang-undangan nasional yang berlaku. PRISMA juga akan memiliki mekanisme scoring diikuti dengan adanya bantuan teknis jika diperlukan. 11 indikator yang ada di dalam PRISMA meliputi profil, kebijakan HAM, mekanisme pengaduan, supply chain, ketenagakerjaan, kondisi buruh, perserikatan buruh, kemudian diskriminasi, privasi, lingkungan, dan sosial. Meskipun PRISMA masih bersifat sukarela, namun diharapkan perusahaan dapat melaksanakan uji tuntas tersebut. Tidak menutup kemungkinan PRISMA dapat menjadi salah satu syarat bagi perusahaan dalam mendaftarkan perusahaannya pada sistem pendaftaran badan hukum di kemudian hari. Hadirin yang saya hormati, izinkan saya pada kesempatan ini menyampaikan apresiasi kepada FIRST yang senantiasa mendukung pemerintah Indonesia dalam menerapkan prinsip-prinsip UNGPs di semua lini. Hal ini diharapkan dapat disinergikan dengan program prioritas pemerintah pada bisnis dan HAM, antara lain penyusunan strategi nasional bisnis dan HAM dalam rangka pengarusutamaan bisnis dan HAM di Indonesia. Oleh karena itu, saya ucapkan terima kasih atas undangannya yang disampaikan dan semoga kegiatan ini dapat bermanfaat bagi kita semua. Sekian, terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Direktur Jenderal Hak Asasi Manusia, Mualimin Abdi.
Terima kasih Bu Hajarati atas sambutannya. Senang UNDP dapat mendukung pengarusutamaan bisnis dan HAM bersama Kemenkumham, Ibu. Ibu berkenan foto bersama sebentar dengan semua para speakers dan panelis ya Ibu. To all the speakers and panelists, we will have a group picture together. Please turn on your camera for a minute or two. Thank you. Pak Pierre Vincent, Ibu Melania, Pak Makarim, Ibu Julie, Pak Marzuki, Miss Julie. Ya. Pak Makarim, Bapak Halo. Makarim. Bapak Makarim mohon menyalakan videonya, Pak, dan Bapak Marzuki juga.
Iya, oke.
Bapak Makarim, kami tunggu kameranya. Ya, sudah. Mas Dila, sudah siap ya? Kita sudah semuanya ya?
Sudah, Mbak.
I will count 1, 2, 3, alright? 1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi ya, one more time. Siap ya Mas Bila ya?
Siap.
1, 2, 3.
Alright.
Sudah Mas Bila? Sudah?
Sudah Mbak.
Oke, thank you everyone. Terima kasih Bila. And now we will move on to the first discussion of our event today. This session will be moderated by Bapak Ciprianus Batesoro, Head of Democratic Governance and Poverty Reduction Unit, UNDP Indonesia. Bapak Cipri, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan, Pak.
Terima kasih, Sagita. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here today with all of you, and I'll be moderating this first session with a very special theme, and it is about preparing for mandatory human rights due diligence, HRDD, and what is there to expect. As an introduction, you know that in the past few years, several European countries, as well as the EU, have adopted or started to consider legislation that embeds elements of human rights due diligence, HRDD, into law. European institutions, United Nations bodies, and other international organizations have also acknowledged the need for binding regulations to promote the implementation of HRDD. This type of regulation is also gaining broader support from the business community, which consider it as a means to help them implement their responsibility to respect human rights. For businesses, HRDD is an ongoing assessment that helps companies mitigate threats that operations may pose to the lives and the dignity of stakeholders, including employees, vulnerable groups, communities, and consumers. Through HRDD, though HRDD is focused on risks to people and not to profitability, HRDD efforts may also help companies to avoid reputational and operational harm that might, for example, happen like a company charges of forced labor, for instance. So we are very delighted and quite fortunate to have 4 panelists for this first session of our dialogue today, who will share with us the progress of HRDD legislations in their respective country and in the EU as a whole. Now I would like to welcome our 4 partners. The first one, Mr. Pierre Vincent, Premier Secretary, the Embassy of France in Jakarta. Selamat siang, Pak Pierre. Very pleased to meet you, Pak. And then the second panelist, Bapak Ralph Astam, First Secretary, Deputy Head of Political Division, the Embassy of Switzerland in Indonesia. Pak Ralph, selamat siang. And the third panelist, Pak Eivind Forbordrovik, Second Secretary, Royal Norwegian Embassy in Jakarta. Selamat siang, Pak Eivind. And the fourth panelist, Pak Christopher Pats, Policy Officer, a European Coalition for Corporate Justice based in Brussels, Belgium. Again, to everyone, I really thank you for joining us today. Now let us proceed with this dialogue. Let me start with the first panelist, Bapak Pierre Vincent from the French Embassy. Let me share with you or ask you that, you know, in 2017, the French Parliament adopted the Corporate Due of Vigilance Law. Perhaps for around 5 minutes now, Pak, we would like to hear from you on the contents of the law. What is the law asking from companies? Which companies are covered under the law? And what are the consequences for companies for not complying with the law? So, Pak Vincent, 5 minutes, over to you.
Good afternoon to all. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my country's, France, practices on HRDD. So as requested, I'm going to briefly introduce the French Duty of Vigilance Law. The first thing is that France has actually passed two important laws that are innovative, mandatory regulations.
Penting. Yang pertama itu adalah mandatory regulation yang berkaitan dengan bisnis.
They are both part of a French mixed policy, building upon the UN guiding principles, OECD guidelines, and ILO instruments as well. So the first law, as you mentioned, Cyprianus, is the 2017 Duty of Vigilance Law. This law aims at large companies. What do we understand by large companies? Actually, the threshold is the following: more than 5,000 employees in France or more than 10,000 employees worldwide. This law requires these companies to put in place a risk identification and management system to prevent or address their negative impacts on human rights, fundamental freedoms, environments, health, and safety. This law covers the whole supply chains. It's important to say that. This 2017 law has been a major breakthrough because it initiated a shift from what was soft to a now hard law by establishing a general and cross-sectoral binding duty of vigilance for companies, designed to make multinational enterprises, MNEs, accountable of the due diligence they conduct. It covers not only the parent companies, but also their subsidiaries, subcontractors, and suppliers as well. Therefore, this piece of legislation has an extraterritorial dimension. I'd like to move now to the means that are offered to lodge a complaint. It also provides for access to remedy with a twofold mechanism. One, either stakeholders or victims send a formal notice to a company about its vigilance plan, and after 3 months, if appropriate, bring the case to court. Or they file a civil liability action if a causal link between the vigilance plan or its absence or deficiencies and alleged damages can be established. So this was the content of the first law, the 2017 Duty of Vigilance Law. The second law was adopted in 2019 and is called Pact Law, which stands for Action Plan for Business Growth and Transformation. This law has introduced into French regulation a 3-tier mechanism requiring all companies to act in the social interest of the company and take into consideration the social and environmental issues of their activity in their strategy. So today, in 2021, we will continue to ensure the enforcement of these two pieces of legislation, which are part of our efforts as set out in our Business and Human Rights National Action Plan that was adopted in 2017. What is the assessment of this law so far? The French Duty of Vigilance Law for parent companies and for those of the supply chain is undeniably a pioneering text at the global level, constituting a first step to guarantee respect for the rights of populations and workers and the environment by the multinational enterprises. Indeed, these companies and all French contractors companies will finally be able to be legally recognized responsible for the human and environmental damages that may be caused by their activities, as well as those of their subsidiaries, subcontractors, and suppliers abroad, which means in Indonesia as well, and will have to answer before a judge if necessary. The achievements and limits of the Duty of Vigilance Law are now identified. Together with the Pact Law, it paves the way for an EU mandatory legislation on due diligence as part of a broader RBC plan, covering also corporate governance. So I would like to end this brief intervention just stating that France is fully supportive of this current move and undertaking within the EU. And that's it for me. Terima kasih banyak.
Yeah, terima kasih banyak, Pak Pierre. You touched a little bit about, there could be consequences or let's say expectations for those companies that are operating in Indonesia. But we will come to that question later. I will ask the same follow-up question on what could be those like consequences or expectations of French companies in Indonesia. But now I would like to turn to the second panelist, and this is Pak Ralph Stam from the Embassy of Switzerland. Pak Ralph, in November 2020, Swiss citizens voted in a referendum to decide whether the Responsible Business Initiative proposal that includes mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence would be added to the Swiss Constitution. Now, I would like to ask you to share with us for about 5 minutes. Can you share with us the process of the development of the RBI proposal? What are the issues that are covered under the RBI proposal? Also, related to that, we heard that the proposal failed to pass, and then the counter proposal will be adopted. Can you also talk a little bit about this counter proposal? So, in 5 minutes, Pak Ralph, it's a big challenge, but please.
Thank you very much, Ciprianus. This is actually will also be a presentation about the Swiss direct democracy political system, which you can see now one example of that. So the Responsible Business Initiative was a popular initiative, and in Switzerland, if 100,000 voters ask for a constitutional amendment, this amendment has to be put to a public vote. So there was a group of people from various sectors of society who collected signatures, who made this proposal to amend the constitution. This was handed in to the federal government in 2016. It was then debated in parliament, also assessed by the government. Parliament had, there were big debates in parliament, and the question was, does the parliament and government want to propose a counter proposal? So, they're not there with empty hands and have to, so to say, confront this popular initiative. In the end, Parliament and the government, they decided to reject the popular initiative, but they drafted a counter proposal. Now, in the vote in November, the popular initiative won a tiny majority of 50.7% of votes, but it was rejected by the majority of cantons, majority of provinces, which means that the initiative will not be amended. But at the same time, automatically now, almost automatically, the counter proposal will come into force. I will just briefly say what the popular initiative was about. It asked all companies to set in place human rights due diligence mechanisms, including for their subsidiaries and their suppliers. And it made companies also liable for their activities and their subsidiaries' activities abroad. And that was the major point of discussion. The arguments of Parliament and government was this is too far-reaching, so they made the counter proposal. Now the counter proposal asks first big companies, and we define big companies smaller than in France. It's only 500 employees. Big companies, they need to make an annual report on their due diligence mechanism they put in place. And this covers human rights, environment, labor, but also corruption. So there is this need for reporting and transparency. Now, there are two specific measures for two sectors or two specific problems. One are minerals that come from conflict areas or high-risk areas. Companies who import minerals from such areas to Switzerland or process such minerals, they need to put in place a risk management system which will allow them to assess risks related to human rights and the environment. Then the second specific aspect is that all companies which sell products or services where there is a risk that child labor was involved, they also need to put in place such a risk assessment system and a due diligence management system. In both cases, this also covers the supply chain, so subsidiaries and suppliers. There's one particular part also about this counter proposal is that if the companies fail to do the report, come up with the reporting, they have to pay a fine, and this is liable. How to say? This goes under the Swiss criminal law. So there's a fine of up to 100,000 Swiss francs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Wow, that was very concise, 5 minutes indeed. Later, I will come back also with the questions about what the consequences as well as expectations for Swiss companies operating in Indonesia. Now, I would like to turn to our third panel, Bapak Evin Forbodrovic. Sorry for if there's mispronunciation of name, Pak Evin, from the Norwegian embassy. Pak Evin, in November 2019, the Ethics Information Committee convened by the Norwegian government recommended the adoption of mandatory corporate human rights due diligence legislation. I would like to invite you to share with us in 5 minutes, what are the obligations for companies under the proposed legislation? Which companies are covered under this legislation, and what is the latest update, the latest status of this legislation? Pak Evin, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Pak Ciprianus, and you did a great job pronouncing my name, actually. So yes, very good. And thank you also for some very concise questions on the proposed bill. Like you mentioned, there is a proposed act on supply chain transparency that's currently being prepared by the relevant ministries in Norway as we speak. Just a brief history of the bill. It stems from several Norwegian political parties back in 2016 that put forward a motion to Parliament on the need for a law on ethics information. They essentially pointed out that, you know, a lack of basic respect for fundamental workers' rights, human rights, characterize significant parts of the production of goods for global markets. And I think also another thing that they pointed out, and rightly so, is that Norwegian consumers in general have little information about how the goods they consume are produced. And so as a response, the Norwegian government appointed an ethics information committee to provide recommendations and proposed legislation to address this, and the bill, or the proposed bill, was presented in 2019. So the starting point for the bill is that the Norwegian government already clearly expects all companies operating in Norway to behave responsibly and to adhere to international rules and guidelines, such as the UN Global Compact or the OECD's guidelines for multinational enterprises. However, they also point to that experience, unfortunately, shows us that voluntary compliance often is not sufficient, and that mandatory legislation is necessary. So the purpose of the act, or the proposed act, is twofold. One is to provide consumers and other stakeholders the right to information on how enterprises impact fundamental human rights. And this is to enable consumers to make informed decisions about the goods that they purchase. And I think this is kind of a key aspect of the bill, is that it's very consumer-centric. It takes the starting point of the consumer and, you know, their right to know what happened in order for them to purchase a good. And then also the second aim is that through duties to know and to disclose information, the bill aims to advance respect for fundamental human rights and decent work in enterprises and supply chain, which hopefully will improve conditions both inside Norway and outside. So to answer your first question, Pac Ciprianus, which companies are covered under the proposed legislation? Simply put, all enterprises that offer goods and services in Norway are covered. However, and this is like in France and Switzerland, it does discern between larger and smaller enterprises. And this is to avoid legal and administrative burdens that are, you know, too big to handle for very small businesses. So I think it's funny that France, you had the biggest definition of a company, Switzerland a bit smaller, and then Norway, we are a lot smaller. So any company that is has above 50 full-time employees or revenues of approximately 8 million USD or assets of approximately 4 million USD are considered large enterprises, and they will have to comply with all the obligations in the proposed legislation. So moving on, what are the obligations? Well, for all enterprises, it obliges them to respond to specific inquiries for information. And this is in order for the companies to be responsible with their customers, and the customers, they have a right to know, and the companies, they have an obligation to respond if the customer wants a specific piece of information. And then in order to be able to reply to said inquiries and to just increase the general awareness of the status of fundamental human rights in their supply chains, all enterprises have a duty to know about human rights issues that occur. However, this duty does vary a bit depending on the size of the enterprise. And then I think another interesting point is that all enterprises that sell goods are obliged to publicly disclose manufacturing sites. And I think this is somewhat groundbreaking, at least because a lot of companies would point to that this is could be a trade secret, for instance, or that this is not necessarily relevant information for the consumers. But this is not, for instance, for listed companies from now on, if this bill is passed, they will have to disclose it in their annual reports. And then for large enterprises, the legislation requires due diligence, essentially investigating or researching their supply chains and their subcontractors with respect to human rights and decent working conditions. And it also requires them to disclose key findings. And this
harus menyebutkan key findings mereka di dalam laporan itu nanti. Dan itu artinya seluruh perusahaan wajib untuk melakukan hal ini. Dan pertanyaan terakhir yang ditanyakan tadi adalah status.
It is in its final preparatory stages before it is put forward to Parliament. This is my personal guess, not an official Norwegian stance by any means, but I believe it should happen before autumn because our parliamentary elections are due this autumn. I know our current government prioritizes this bill, so I would hazard a guess that it will be put forward to Parliament before the election. And then if I can just end this with a brief parting message and kind of a key takeaway, I think for companies or enterprises that sell goods or services to companies in Norway or companies operating in Norway, I believe this bill, if passed, would increase the scrutiny on supply chains from companies that sell goods in Norway. And this concerns respect for fundamental rights, but also decent working conditions. And now I'm just speaking as a Norwegian consumer. I think we take workers' rights very seriously in Norway. And for instance, the right to unionize is highly prized in Norway. So this is just something to keep in the back of the head that I think I would expect increased scrutiny in the coming years. But like others have touched upon, like Marina from the Swedish embassy, with increased scrutiny, I think there's also an opportunity. And for manufacturers exporting to Norway, I think you will see that respect for human rights and sound working conditions will become a competitive advantage.
Dan bagaimana caranya mereka bisa menjadi berkompetitif atau bersaing dengan sehat. Itu saja, terima kasih.
Now, let me turn to our fourth panelist. This is Pak Christopher Patz, European Coalition for Corporate Justice. Pak Christoph, good morning to you there. Certainly, it's from an afternoon time in Jakarta. Pak Christopher, we are aware that your organization, the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, which is based in Brussels, is following closely the development of EU mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. I would like to invite you to share with us for about 5 minutes about the process of EU mandatory human rights legislation development, human rights legislation development, and then what are the obligations for companies under the proposed legislation, and which companies, the size of the companies that are covered under this proposed legislation. Pak Christopher, the time is yours.
Thank you so much, Ciprianos, and good day to everyone on the call. It's a real pleasure to be here. Also, a particular good morning or good day to the dignitaries. And yeah, maybe just a quick word about the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. It's a European-wide network of NGOs, trade unions, lawyers, and academics who work to advocate for the legalization of the UNGPs and human rights and environmental due diligence And there are many businesses in Europe as well, which are also advocating for legislation at the EU level for human rights due diligence legislation. And as you mentioned, Ciprianos, there is indeed a legislative process happening in Brussels, in the European Union capital, presently. And whilst we don't have a legislative proposal yet, we do expect one to come before mid-year. So by June, the European Commission, which is the first law-making body of the European Union, will propose a law, which will then go to the European Parliament for discussion, and then all the member states of the European Union through the Council will also have a say. We can expect this process to go on for at least another 2 years. So there is still time for a lot of discussion and a lot of the details to be fleshed out. But I think I would echo the message from the former speaker, Evan, that this is coming. This is very much coming, and it's a very much an expectation which is being turned into law. So there is, of course, time for the private sector to adapt to these new standards, to these new expectations. And indeed, as Pierre made clear in the case of the French law, these new liabilities.
Atau dunia usaha untuk menjalankan uji tuntas ini, dan undang-undang baru ini akan dikeluarkan dengan penegakan baru atau mekanisme penegakan baru, di mana perusahaan-perusahaan di Perancis dapat dimintai tanggung jawabnya di pengadilan apabila mereka tidak melakukan pemenuhan terhadap undang-undang tersebut. Begitu pula bagi bisnis mereka yang mereka jalankan di luar Perancis. Dan ada juga kasus di hadapan pengadilan Belanda ya terhadap perusahaan migas di Nigeria ya yang waktu itu diadili di Belanda. Jadi waktu itu perusahaan tersebut
access to remedy, access to judicial remedy for overseas victims.
Jadi di Nigeria, dan untuk korban-korban di luar negeri, dan di dalam hal ini di Indonesia, kalau misalnya ada perusahaan-perusahaan luar negeri ya misalnya, atau perusahaan-perusahaan dari kami yang bekerja atau memiliki cabang atau bisnis di Indonesia, dan apabila melakukan pelanggaran di Indonesia, maka perusahaan-perusahaan tersebut juga dapat diadili di negara kami. Jadi untuk memberikan upaya hukum.
On the table right now, there has been a parliamentary report. And it does advocate for a very wide scope. So compared to all the other legislative initiatives discussed so far, the European Parliament, or the Legal Affairs Committee to be precise, has said that they believe that a European mandatory due diligence law should apply to pretty much all companies, all European companies, including small and medium enterprises that operate in high-risk sectors. What is a high-risk sector? That is still something that would have to be defined. But I think we could imagine that it's a sector, say, for instance, such as textile, where we know that there are systematic human rights and labor issues, or areas or sectors where forced labor is particularly prevalent. So that's the company scope. How far down the chain are we looking here? And the European Parliament's proposal is that this should be very much aligned with the UNGP approach and go all the way down the chain according to how salient the human rights issue is. And that really, it doesn't put an obligation on companies to look at every single human right in detail every day or at every step of the business operation.
Secara kesehariannya di dalam operasi bisnis. Jadi perusahaan-perusahaan ini diminta untuk melihat apa saja yang merupakan aspek-aspek HAM di dalam operasi bisnis mereka, misalnya di bidang tekstil, misalnya kerja paksa atau forced labor, atau misalnya di bidang kimia, misalnya aspek HAM yang penting, misalnya kesehatan, kalau misalnya perusahaan-perusahaan tersebut bekerja di bidang kimia ya. Dan tentunya perusahaan-perusahaan ini terkait dengan standar due diligence atau uji tuntas tersebut, kami berupaya supaya perusahaan-perusahaan tersebut menjalankannya sesuai dengan kerangka atau panduan OECD dan juga UNGP. Selain itu, minggu lalu, 3 menteri Jerman di dalam perusahaan koalisi Jerman mengumumkan rencana mereka untuk undang-undang uji tuntas hak asasi manusia di bidang supply chain atau di bidang rantai pasokan, dan Jerman dan yang merupakan negara yang merupakan bagian Uni Eropa, dan maksud saya menyampaikan contoh ini adalah ingin menyampaikan kepada Bapak Ibu merupakan ini tren yang jelas yang terjadi di Uni Eropa terkait dengan pentingnya undang-undang ini, dan juga kita bisa bekerja sama dalam implementasinya. Dan ECCJ juga bekerja sama dengan partner NGO atau LSM di Indonesia, dan elemen kunci dari undang-undang ini ke depannya yang dapat kita bayangkan adalah untuk mempromosikan atau mendorong diskusi antar pemangku kepentingan antara LSM dan juga trade union atau perserikatan kerja, dan ini yang kita harapkan ke depannya di dalam undang-undang ini, dan juga dialog yang lebih banyak. Dan saya ucapkan terima kasih atas undangan yang diberikan kepada saya untuk menghadiri acara ini. Terima kasih banyak Pak Christopher atas penjelasan Bapak yang sangat komprehensif. Dan sekarang saya punya satu pertanyaan follow up atau tidak lanjut kepada semua panelis, kepada Pak Pierre, Pak Ralph, dan Pak Elvin, dan juga Pak Christopher. Pertanyaan saya adalah apa ekspektasi atau harapan terkait dengan efek dari undang-undang baru yang sekarang sedang digodok ya di negara Bapak, di negara Anda, dan juga di negara Prancis, Swiss, Norwegia, dan juga tentunya negara perusahaan-perusahaan dari negara-negara Eropa lain yang beroperasi di Indonesia ya. Saya berharap Anda dapat memberikan jawaban ini mungkin dalam 2 atau 3 menit supaya kami juga bisa mempelajari dari apa yang Bapak bagikan atau Bapak sharing. Mari kita mulai dengan Pak Pierre ya, terkait dengan apa dampak undang-undang baru tersebut terhadap undang-undang terhadap perusahaan-perusahaan di negara Anda. Terima kasih banyak Pak Sipri dan juga rekan-rekan lain terkait dengan insight dari topik yang sangat menarik ini. Jadi pertanyaannya adalah bagaimana kondisinya sekarang?
It's a bit too early to have a quite and complete assessment of the scope of it. But we know that in France, for example, after 3 years of this new law, at the moment, we have several formal notices that have been sent to companies, and we are dealing, I think, if I'm not mistaken, with 3 cases brought to court in France. The thing is that we're not, we still don't know whether it's civil or trade court for some of the offenses that we're dealing with. Generally speaking, I think it's this law in France and Europe, and this current trend that Christopher was stressing formally, that it's a very important first step. I mean, the achievements are identified clearly, but of course, I mean, there is still room for improvement ahead of us. When we're talking with companies, some of them are telling that it's still vague and unevenly shared understanding of what the Duty of Vigilance Law is concretely, you know. So it needs harmonization. It needs more dialogue with trade unions, with NGOs, with organizations, with stakeholders, such as we are just doing today. It's very relevant, and I think we should carry on this way. I will not be too long, so I will stop here, and I thank you very much, Pak Cyprianus, again.
Thank you, Pak Pierre. Now for Pak Ralph, the question is the same. Pak Ralph, do you also expect Swiss companies in Indonesia to observe the legislation that's developed in Switzerland? Pak Ralph, 2 to 3 minutes.
Yes, so regarding the counter proposal that I described before, which will probably come into force soon, I would expect that customers of Indonesian companies in Switzerland, they will ask more questions. They will need more information because this is what they have to put in their annual reports. So the effect will be similar with the initiative in Norway, where it will create more transparency. So also the suppliers of all the big Swiss companies, they will have to increase their transparency and share more information. That's what I would expect. Now, in the specific case of companies mining minerals in high-risk areas and in conflict areas, they will have to be somehow included in the due diligence management system of the customer. Difficult to say how much integrated, but I think there will be still additional need for more information on that. The same in sectors where there is a risk of child labor. If the companies, the suppliers are not.
Dan apabila perusahaan-perusahaan atau supplier tersebut tidak bisa memberikan informasi atau transparansi, dan saya rasa konsekuensinya adalah mereka bisa kehilangan customer atau pelanggan mereka apabila mereka tidak bisa memberikan transparansi terkait HAM. Terima kasih banyak Pak Ralph, jelas sekali, dan sekarang saya ingin mengundang Pak Elvin. Jadi Bapak berbicara secara komprehensif tadi terkait dengan kebutuhan transparansi bagi perusahaan-perusahaan.
Pak Sipri, it seems like we are losing him.
Pak Sipri, sepertinya kami tidak dapat mendengar Bapak. Oh maaf, saya kira internet saya yang kurang stabil tadi.
I think we can continue the discussion while waiting for him to be reconnecting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think I already covered these questions during my first intervention, but just to reiterate very quickly, we don't have that many Norwegian companies with subsidiaries in Indonesia, but we do have, if you look at trade statistics, the majority of goods exported from Indonesia to Norway are manufactured goods in fairly labor-intensive sectors like footwear, clothing and apparel, etc. So for those Indonesian companies that export to Norway, like I said previously, I would expect increased scrutiny when it comes to respect for human rights and working conditions. And yes, I'm going to keep it brief, so I'll just leave it at that, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Replacing Pak Sipri while he's still reconnecting. We still have a few minutes for some questions from the. We will just take one question. Perhaps our session now, a representative from the governments. I'm taking question about what is the role of some governments if there's not applying human rights principle and therefore limiting the company's ability to respect and promote human rights. How do we reconcile this tension? So what about the role of some governments in not applying human rights principle that is limiting companies' ability to respect and promote human rights? Perhaps I could let Pak Ralph to answer this first. Pak Sipri is now back. I will give the floor to him. Pak Sipri, we are taking one question from the floor about how we reconcile the tension when the government is not promoting or respecting human rights. How do we reconcile this to the business? Please continue.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sagita. I followed you reading the question, so I would now like to invite our panelists.
Shall I start?
Yeah, please, Pak Ralph.
I think that goes to back to the roots of the UN guiding principles, actually, because the idea was, even though the governments have the duty to protect human rights, not all governments come up to that duty and actually implement the protection of human rights. So knowing that businesses are very important actors in today's world, the idea was to work together with the companies and make them also work towards the protection of human rights. So that does not seem to be a problem, because this is part of the situation in which this was set up. I think that the issue is for the competition between companies. I think that is an issue that companies will look at. What kind of obligations or what kind of rules they have to comply with, and this is made by their governments, the governments where the companies have their, but then also by the consumers. And as it was mentioned in the introductory speeches, I think the demand from consumers will get stronger, and it's in the end it's the responsibility of the companies also in countries where the human rights are not protected.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Ralph. Maybe another perspective from Pak Pierre.
No more perspective. I think Ralph said covered and wrapped it perfectly. I have nothing to add on that.
Thank you, Pak Pierre.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Pierre. And now I'm reading the next question. I think I'll invite Pak Christopher to respond. In the final report of the EU study on due diligence requirements through the supply chain, it is mentioned that there will be a notion of cross-sectoral human rights due diligence. I noticed that Mr. Pierre said that in France it will also already implement in French law. I wonder how about the inside other representatives of countries in these cross-sectoral issues. This is the question from Ibu Ratih Ananda Gustoro. Perhaps a quick perspective from Pak Christopher and then Pak Ivan. Pak Christopher, please.
Just to say that the European legislative plans are going to be cross-sectorial, as the study concludes. So that means every sector will be covered. As Pierre mentioned, this is the French approach too, is that it's applying to all sectors, whether that is energy or textile or agriculture or manufacturing. And then also for the German proposal, which was announced last week, was also a cross-sectorial initiative. As I understand, the Swiss is very much focused in particular on mining, but we can anticipate, my guess would be, is for a broadening of that scope of application. If I may, I just wanted to respond to the first question, just because I think for the benefit of the private sector, just to know that a key part of the due diligence expectations of European companies expecting of their Indonesian subsidiaries or business relationships, at the very least, will be adherence to core ILO conventions. So the working conditions outlined in there. So in terms of preparing, we can expect that if European companies are liable for breaches of the core ILO conventions in their supply chains, then they will very much be closely monitoring their business partners in Indonesia and around the world as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Pak Christopher. Now let me read. This is a very good question from Papa or Ibu Luluk Andriani. We understand.
Maaf, sebelum melanjutkan, kita waktunya sudah agak sedikit molor. Mungkin hanya satu question. Setelah itu kita.
Pak Sipri, sorry to interrupt you. It seems that we can only take one more questions because
we understand that in supply chain operational, sometimes have third party. Until which level of supply chain that HRDD expect to be implemented, and is there any standard to it? I would invite probably Pak Ivin to share your quick views on this.
Yeah, terima kasih, Pak Ciprianus. I only caught the latter half of the question because of the translation, but I think it had to do with to what level of depth can we expect companies to do due diligence on their supply chains? Is it a subcontractor of their subcontractor or their subcontractor? Was that right? Yes.
Yes.
I can't speak for the other countries, but as far as I understand, having read through the proposed legislation in Norway, you will be liable for all of it. However, again, it does vary a bit on the size of the company, just the legal obligations you have. But I think there's also some degree of common sense built into it as well. Unfortunately, it's not possible necessarily for a big company to know every subcontractor of every subcontractor of every subcontractor. And the degree of liability will probably be much higher at the immediate links. And then, again, our bill is yet to pass, so it's still not final. I would imagine probably lobbies for industry interests might want a bit looser definition of what they are liable for, and maybe other stakeholders want a stricter definition. But I think the starting point is that you are liable for all of it. Just it varies maybe a bit how strictly it will be enforced for, if you go far down. So yes, that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Ivin. With that, I would now like to conclude this session. I think it's really good for everyone to be aware that now there is a growing awareness of, from the consumer side to call for a more transparent and accountable business practices. And in Europe, some of these are even put into legislations. Those they are still in process, but I think it's good for companies to be aware that it's coming. That there will be certain calls for them to, either it's on risk management, on transparent measures, and so on, that should be put in place. But as it is mentioned in my introduction, the more companies look into that, it's something will be very good for their reputations in the view of the eyes of the consumer. With that, again, I would like to thank our panelists for today, Pak Ivin, Pak Ralph, Pak Pierre, and Pak Christopher. A very nice session. Now I will, return to Ibu Sagita to move to the next session. Thank you very much, Bapak dan Ibu.
Thank you, Pak Sipri, Pierre, Christopher, Elvin, and Ralph for this very informative and interesting discussion. As we could see that we have so many questions from the floor, but unfortunately we could not answer them, but we will keep their question for our record, and we will share for the panelists too. And then now we are moving on to the next session, but before we are moving to the next session, we would like to ask a quick feedback from everyone on this dialogue. A survey or a poll will appear on your screen for 2 or 3 minutes, and we greatly appreciate your participation to fill in the survey. The result will be shared at the later parts of today. Mas Dila, mohon silakan untuk surveinya. Silakan Bapak dan Ibu bisa partisipasinya untuk mengisi surveinya. Kita akan tunggu sampai kurang lebih 2 atau 3 menit. Mas Dila, ini sepertinya saya tidak bisa, oke. Saya harap yang lain bisa untuk mengisi juga ya. Kami masih akan tunggu untuk mengisi votingnya buat para peserta. Dan para panelis juga dipersilakan untuk mengikuti surveinya.
One more minute.
Baik, Mas Dila.
Thirty seconds. Alright, Mbak Gita, we can end the poll right now.
Oke, terima kasih Mas Dila. Terima kasih Bapak dan Ibu untuk partisipasinya. Saya sudah. Oke, baik. Now we are moving on to the second session of the fireside chat with representatives from companies from the private sectors. In this session, we will give the opportunity for companies to share their good practices in respect for human rights, which include human right due diligence implementation and their contribution to SDG as well, and also the challenges that they face implementing this. This session will be led by Bapak Bahtiar Manurung, Operation Director of FIRST. Waktu dan tempat kami persilakan Pak Bahtiar.
All right, thank you very much, Ibu Gita. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody, especially for the audience who join us from outside of Indonesia. So after listening to the progress of human rights due diligence in some of European countries and in the European Union, we will have a fireside chat or casual conversation, if you will, to learn what actions that companies, global companies and local companies have taken to integrate respect for human rights within their operation. We are very fortunate that we have 4 speakers on our panel today. 3 of the speakers represent global companies, while 1 speaker represents a very large national company. But all of these companies that the speaker represents have one thing in common. They have all publicly announced their commitment to respect human rights. So before we dive into the discussion, let me quickly introduce our speakers for this session. Speaker number 1 is Pak Mahmud Samuri from Bumi Resources. Selamat siang, Pak. Thank you for joining. The next speaker is Pak Karyanto Wibowo, Director Sustainable Development of Danone Indonesia. Terima kasih for joining us today, Pak Karyanto. And then the third speaker, third speaker we have Julie Fala, who joins us from Paris today. She is a L'Oreal Global Vice President for Human Rights. Thank you for joining us, Julie. And the fourth speaker we have Rachel Cowburn-Walden. She is Global Director, Human Rights Stewardship, Integrated Social Sustainability, Unilever, who joins us from London. Good morning, Rachel. Thank you to all of the speakers who join us today. So I will start this conversation by addressing the speakers who join us from quite far away from Europe and from UK. And then I will continue with the speakers who join us from Indonesia. With that, I will start with L'Oreal. So human rights is an issue that L'Oreal has been addressing for years. And L'Oreal is a signatory to the UN Global Compact since 2003. And as a signatory to the UN Global Compact, L'Oreal principles includes human rights principle. And in 2017, L'Oreal published L'Oreal Human Rights Policy. So Julie, can you briefly explain to us what's the content of this L'Oreal Human Rights Policy and how is the policy communicated to L'Oreal's operation around the globe, especially in Indonesia?
Thank you very much for your question. As you rightly mentioned, it's really about a journey. You know, human rights issues are broad. We have seen that in the first panel. It's complex. It's evolving also a lot, and so as the maturity also of the international community. So it's good that all the international organizations, civil society, businesses are putting their strengths together to to go along this journey. And as you said, we indeed signed the UNGC's principles some years ago, and also we endorsed the UN guiding principles, which are more recent. And again, we are continuing this journey. So we issued a global human rights policy in 2017. Which is applicable, everywhere in our operations and in our supply chains. And more recently, in 2020, we updated this policy with a focus on workers, so with our employee human rights policy. And we also have, equivalent policies and principles for our suppliers and value chain. For example, we have a mutual ethical commitment letter, which is signed by our suppliers, and that is cascaded alongside the value chain. And to go back to your question, how do we do to make sure this is embedded throughout the group, because we are a big group with many employees, nearly 100,000 employees, many suppliers also, and presence all over the world in 70 countries. So again, it's a journey, and it takes time to make sure it's cascaded down the chain, and because of many challenges also of turnover, so you have always to be vigilant and to keep the ball, let's say, rolling. So we organized, suppliers days and training on a very regular basis through various means, voila. And we also have a grievance mechanism in place. We call it Speak Up internally, to encourage, workers to raise potential concerns they may have regarding human rights.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Julie. I noticed that you mentioned the way L'Oreal communicate the policy that has included the suppliers is through training or suppliers day. My follow-up question to that is that has human rights been included in the, for example, procurement process? And then also, has L'Oreal conducted, monitoring and implementation of the policy in supply chains, particularly in Indonesia? If you can have a word on that, that'll be great.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, human rights is really a journey, and we are making, progress day after day. And more recently, in our employee human rights policy, we took a new commitment, which is based on living wage, to make sure that our workers, but also the workers of our strategic suppliers, including in Indonesia, are granted a living wage. And because it's a complex issue, and L'Oréal will not manage to solve this issue alone. We are working together with many other players, including Unilever. So I'm glad Rachel is here today, and other companies, with the help of the UN. So for example, we are part of the UNGC Decent Work in Value Chain work stream, and also in other platforms. So again, we will not manage to solve these endemic issues, for example, fight against poverty or climate change alone. We will not manage alone. So again, we are working together. So to go back to your point regarding monitoring, we are doing, through our procurement work, some social audits, which include human rights provision in it, on forced labor, child labor, decent working conditions, and non-discrimination, and many other points. And we are doing more than 1,000 audits per year. But because it's not enough, that's why I mentioned also, the grievance mechanism and other systems and processes that we have in place to help us identify potential breaches, because social audits are great, but again, it's necessary, but we need to go further.
Thank you for that further explanation, Julie. I know that you mentioned the word vigilance. I'd like to come back to you on that later, but we've talked for about 5 minutes. So with that, I will move on to the next speaker. I will continue with Unilever, with Rachel, an introduction on Unilever's human rights background. Unilever, of course, is a founding signatory of UN Global Compact, and Unilever is one of the very few companies that have prepared a standalone human rights progress report. And in 2014, Unilever launched standalone human rights policy. So same question which I asked to Julie. Please, can you talk a little bit about the policy and how is it being implemented around the world, particularly in Indonesia?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm always very humble when I speak on panels such as this, because we do not have all the answers as Unilever. We do not get everything right all the time, and it's a real opportunity to learn from others as well. So I do this very much in the spirit of humbleness and learning. As you say, we committed in 2014 to implement the UN Guiding Principles and to report on our progress publicly. In 2015, as you say, we published our human rights policy statement. And in line with the UNGPs, we base our human rights commitment on the International Bill of Rights, the ILO Fundamental Principles of Rights at Work. And as a colleague previously mentioned, labor rights are human rights, no distinction there. And we support the OECD guidelines. So in terms of our policies, we have a strong policy framework. So that's our internal policies, our Respect, Dignity and Fair Treatment Code policy, our Code of Business Principles. And then we have our policies for our suppliers and business partners. So our responsible sourcing policy, responsible business partner policy, and then commodities specific policies too, whether that's around palm or high risk commodities or others. So in terms of implementation and how do we actually publicize those policies, well, they're all available on our websites, and they are a fundamental requirement if an organization wants to do business with Unilever. And that requirement is verified depending on the risk, on the commodity or the country where that supplier or business partner is based. So that will be, for example, in a high-risk country or commodity, that will be an independent, external, on-the-ground audit. But we know, of course, that audits also have limitations. It's just a snapshot on one day. So we also carry out human rights impact assessments, for example. And as Julie said, the voices of rights holders, the ability of grievance mechanisms, working with trade union partners, for example, is absolutely critical as well. And, you know, as I was saying, these issues are many of these issues that are found in global value chains are endemic, and therefore it's also proactively addressing the root causes of the issues too, so that we're not just going and reacting. And as Julie said, that's something that we cannot do alone. And that's why we work in collaboration, both with other business partners and with peer companies, but also in a multi-stakeholder level, academics and civil society.
Thank you for explaining very briefly about Unilever human rights policy. I noted that you mentioned, of course, it's commendable that human rights policy of L'Oreal and Unilever has really followed the suggestion of the UN Guiding Principles. It refers to the responsibility to respect all of international recognized human rights. It's approved by the highest level of authority. And then it also, you know, stipulates expectation for the employees and also for the suppliers. And one thing that I note from your answers and also from the report, Unilever has really known the first step to integrate the human rights, particularly human rights due diligence, which is identification of the most salient or significant risk. And in Unilever 2017 Human Rights Report, it was mentioned there are 8 most salient reports. Maybe can you mention just a couple of that, especially the most significant in Indonesia?
Yes, absolutely. So we have 8 salient human rights issues, so global issues. So they will be issues, for example, such as forced labor, so eradication of forced labor, absolutely critical. Wages, as Julie, we've made a commitment also for our own operations, but for our suppliers as well, to pay a living wage. So working hours, of course, absolutely critical. So really make certain there's not excessive working hours. Land rights, absolutely critical, and a real focus for us also on land rights. And then, of course, you'd have health and safety, discrimination, harassment. So they are our key 8 global salient human rights issues. We also review those regularly, and we also look at the local level. To your point, in some countries, some issues may be more prevalent than others. What we also find is you have emerging salient human rights issues. So, for example, looking at the intersection between human rights and climate change, particularly looking at issues around race sectors, for example, in economies too, and also things like the changing world of work, automation, AI. So it's really important that there's an ongoing process of monitoring and verification in terms of what these salient human rights issues are.
Thank you for sharing that additional explanation. And I did note down that there is a similarity. One line similar for L'Oreal and Unilever. It's a journey. It's a journey. No one is perfect. It's an ongoing process. I'll come back to you and to Julie later on if time allows. So I'll move on to the third speaker from Bumi Resources, Pak Mahmud. Bumi Resources. Yeah, terima kasih Pak for joining. Bumi Resources is one of very few companies in Indonesia that have publicly announced commitment to respect human rights that gives reference to UN Guiding Principles. And I think that's the reason, part of the reason why Bumi Resources scored very well in our assessment in 2019, assessment of 100 largest publicly listed companies on their implementation of human rights. So, and in 2018, Bumi also has published human rights policy, similar to the other speaker. Please, can you talk a little bit about this policy and how it's implemented in Bumi's operation and supply chain?
Okay, Pak Bahtiar, thank you for inviting us in this prestigious forum to talk about human rights. Well, speaking of one of the mining company, the large mining company in Indonesia, we know that we realize that respecting human rights should be the responsibility of every company. And we know that mining company is part of the company that is that has a high risk in the industry. And also we operate in a large area, which is also in touch with the local community. And then, so our risk is getting bigger when we are dealing with the community and with the environment. Therefore, as part of the awareness and ongoing process, we already adopt the UNGP on United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, and also the International Bill of Human Rights and ILO Convention on Fundamental Principle and right of workers into our policy, and to show the respect of human rights and also the promote the value of human rights. How we can put it into practice? After we have developed the policy, our homework comes to the socialization to everyone, to employees, and then that's why we try to translate that into actionable policy. I mean, this is the high-level policy, and we need to put in place into the smaller policy, which can be done by every individual according to their role and responsibility. So therefore, our company translate that policy into, first one is in the company code of conduct. So we have set up the code of conduct, in which part of the code of
conduct. Dan di dalam hal tersebut ini juga disebutkan adanya penghapusan tenaga kerja paksa.
And also no child labor. And also we are committed to provide a healthy working environment and also freedom of association. One of the evidence that we provide freedom for association is one of our mining unit now have 7 labor union. Maybe that's one of the rare situation with the company. In one company, there is 7 labor union until now. And we communicate to everyone. We do the roadshow. We did the roadshow to the business unit to do the presentation, bringing their awareness. So everything starts from their awareness that we have this policy. And also in business unit, they have to translate the policy into their own internal policy. So they adopt the policy in the upper unit, and then they have to make their own policy according to their context, but with the same spirit that we respect the human rights. So in mining mining area, so we also translate that into some clause in the collective labor union, collective labor agreement, or the CLA. We also translate what is mentioned in the policy regarding the no child labor, and then the providing a healthy and safe working environment, and also how we deal with the supply chains. In our supply chains, we also include this policy into as part of the requirement for our partner to respect the human rights, in which they have to state their commitment and written commitment that they don't do the child labor in the production of their goods that is delivered to us. And also, even some example is like we do the reclamation project at mine sites, in which the reclamation project usually involve the nursery. So we have to make sure that the nursery is not done by the child labor or the forced labor to produce the plantations that we will grow in our reclamation area. And we also include in the human resources policy, and also in some aspect in the business unit policy, we have to adopt this clause. And as part of the journey, we have done the socialization, we have done the setting up the policy, and actually it's come up first after we done the due diligence on the social and environmental, and it come up that recommendation that okay, we have done all of the good things, but what is lacking is we are lacking on the written policy that we respect the human rights. And then starting in 2018, we have adopt this UNGP principle into our policy, and now we are in the process of continuous improvement in developing good practice, and therefore it's part of the journey for us.
Thank you for sharing that very thorough manner or ways Bumi put in place the integration of respect for human rights. And what I write down is that putting the policy into a more specific procedures is the key in implementation of human rights policy in Bumi. So because we have used the 5 times allotted for that, now I need to move on to the next speaker, and then hopefully we'll have time again to come back to you, Pak.
Okay.
Now let's turn to the last speaker, Bapak Karyanto from Danone Indonesia. Pak Karyanto, are you still with us?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Right. So, a little introduction to Danone. Danone Global, as a French company, has also, of course, prepared vigilance plans that include human rights identification, which suggests that Danone also addressing and manage the. And Danone Indonesia is well recognized for its sustainability practice. In fact, Danone Indonesia is the only fast-moving consumer goods company that received B Corp certification, which is a recognition of Danone's environmental practice and positive human rights impact for its employees and communities. Can you share a little bit about this, Pa, and also Danone's policies related with respect for human rights that has been implemented in Indonesia, Pak?
Yeah. Thank you, Pak Batiar. So good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So basically, in respecting to the human rights, Danone has established the Code of Business Conduct Policy, and then this document is really extend the human rights commitment to all Danone employee, but also to the entire supply chains. Okay, and then this Code of Business Ethics provide the company that respect to the human rights of our employee as set out of the basic conventions to the International Labor Organization or ILO. And then as part of the Danone commitment to the human rights in 2016, the company joined the Consumer Goods Forum or CGF. It is a collective effort to eradicate forced labor from the global supply chain. And then to meet this goal, back to 2017, Danone also incorporated the 3 priorities identified by the Consumer Goods Forum into our fundamental social principle, which is every worker should have freedom of movement, no worker should pay for a job, and then no worker should be in debt or coerced to work. And then you mentioned also, okay, one more thing, just to give you an idea also that in 2019, we participated to the launch of the Business for Inclusive Growth coalitions, or B4IG, which is the coalition coordinated by the UCD, where Danone is leading this coalition, which aim to scaling up the industry actions on inclusive growth, and in particular on the human right through the value chain. You mentioned before as well on the B Corp certification. Yeah, in Indonesia, Danone, through Danone Aqua, we are so far the only FMCG company certified by B Corp. Of course, we hope there will be more company being certified. And then human right also one of the elements where really being assessed by B Corp, which is the B Corp is really require, the policy of the company on many different elements of human rights, such as the non-discriminations and the harassment policy, statement on working hours, pay and performance issue, and then grievance resolutions, statement regarding the right to collective freedom of associations. Bumi has many, I think the same for us. We have many also the associations within our company, and then also, of course, prohibition for forced labor and also child labor. So, of course, on top, also being assessed by B Corp related to the non-discrimination policy. And then last point is that, of course, we need to make sure that our employee understand about the policy, and then they really implement this policy. We have also conduct kind of a mandatory training for all of our employees through the e-learning, and also do many different channel of training, including also the suppliers. And then we have a kind of, I would say, the compliance line, so that every employee can also do the reporting online if they see that there is an issue or a challenge in terms of the human rights.
Thank you for that brief explanation, Pak Karyanto. I noticed that Danone is really concerned about forced labor, and then that's why Danone issued anti-forced labor statement. And as you mentioned, it's also being part of the thing that is assessed by B Corp. So would you share with us lesson learned during this B Corp certification? Any events of violation, or probably not violation, room for improvement on forced labor practice, if any, in Indonesia?
Yeah, I would say that we are a developing country. Okay, whilst actually the policy is issued actually to be implemented globally. Therefore, we have to make sure, because actually there is no kind of exception. We have to implement this policy. But of course, the challenge that we face in Indonesia and then in developed country like in Europe or maybe in US can be different. So therefore, implementing this kind of policy to the entire chain is not easy. Because first, when we are dealing with the suppliers, for example, the level of understanding, compliance, and also the maturity of the supplier is different. So therefore, we have to make sure we do the proper, I would say, educations on this policy, and then we do the proper audit. We implement kind of where there's a platform which is SEDEC, where the supplier will do the self-assessment, and then from the self-assessment, if we see the potential, I would say, non-compliant of things to improve, then we do the mandatory audit. And then the other point is that the regulatory. I think it is good from the speaker before, from the Ministry of, from the government, about the implementation of this kind of policy. But I think some policy already in place. But I think we need to make sure that we put really a control through the government, of course, and also the monitoring. This will help us. For example, on the wages, how to make sure that the wages is really being implemented. And then also, of course, there are informal sector workers. This is something that we need to address as well. How we should to improve, and also if possible to do kind of advocacy on what we can do to address the informal workers, because this is still happening in Indonesia. For example, on the area of the waste collection, for example, then what we can do together to improve. And then also, of course, at the end, our code of conduct, our policy related to human rights should be able to company as our supplier majority to improve and also to learn in terms of the best practice how to implement the standard for their business. Yeah,
Okay,
that was our experience.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Pak Karyanto. Now I will have open questions because we have quite limited time allotted for this session. So I will have one open question for all of the speakers in this session. One question from me and one question from the floor. So one question from me is really related with the theme today. Do you have any plan to carry out human rights due diligence in the near future? If not, if yes, how do you plan to do that? What is the scope? If not, what are missing? So do you have any plan to carry out human rights due diligence, because it's going to become mandatory in the near future? Secondly, there is a question from a floor. The requirement for suppliers to respect human rights, is that applicable to all types of suppliers, including small enterprises? So there's an open question for all the speakers. Who would want to go first?
I'm happy to go first. It's Rachel. I mean, we are already doing human rights due diligence. Human rights due diligence is a critical critical element, should I say, of UN guiding principles. So companies being able to identify, prevent, remediate, and importantly account for what's happening within their global supply chains is critical. What we really want to push is really to have some of that alignment and level playing field, which is why we are supportive of mandatory human rights due diligence. In terms of the second question, the suppliers, yes, our human rights requirements are for all suppliers or indeed business partners who want to do business with Unilever. Now, obviously, the focus is predominantly on our tier 1 suppliers, those we have the direct contracts with. However, we know that much of the human rights abuse and negative impacts is further up the supply chain. And therefore, we also work with our suppliers to cascade those requirements. And also, as I was mentioning, addressing these issues and the root causes of these issues at an industry level, so that ultimately, you know, all the supplies with the supply chain, all levels would be covered. But obviously, you know, that does become more difficult and more complex the further up the supply chain you go.
Thank you for your view on that, Rachel. Maybe next.
Yes, can I move because I think I need to leave soon. Sorry. So I think just to terima kasih. So just to amplify on what mentioned before by Unilever, I think we believe that kind of a mandatory framework would really create kind of a, you know, the competitive level of playing field and also provide business with more leverage and deliver on human rights advancement, which is this is really central, I would say, to build back better, especially with, you know, with the current COVID-19 situations. And then of course we need to do together, we need to collaborate. Therefore we have also the E4IG coalition, which is most of the company are joining this coalition as well. So we need to collaborate and we need to push together. And then as for the supplier, the supply chain, I think more or less the same, which is we apply for our first tier suppliers, but also extended to the second tier supplier for the selected category depending on the threshold, and also the strategic you know, materials that involving to our production. So this is how we apply, and then of course this is also applied for Indonesia.
Bastian, maybe I can follow the next to give the answer to your question. Yeah. Well, regarding the plan for human rights due diligence, actually we planned it last year, but unfortunately the situation does not allow us to do so, and we are planning maybe the Q2 in this year. We expect that we can do this due diligence because we know that that is the next step that we should do. I mean, we know that we have the written commitment, and we have to measure what is the impact, what is the what we have done so far. Therefore, it is a pleasure for us to take this opportunity later in the Q2 to do the human rights due diligence. Before it's just for us just sort of having the self check. I mean, like we know that we have done the socialization, we know we create a policy, but we need to measure whether we still have another potential, so that we know that we have to do some more improvement, because for us it's a journey, and we know that we should do the improvement continuously. But we always make sure regarding the involvement of the contractors in the assessment on the practice that respect the human rights. Now we implement to the contractors by putting in the contract. So we put it in writing in the agreement within the company and the contractors. We clearly stated on the certain clause that showing the respect of the human rights, and also it's if they fail to do so, they have committed to do so, but they find that they failed, then we have the right to terminate the contract. It's part of the clause that we mentioned in the contract, and we expect that maybe later we'll extend to the next tier of suppliers so that we can have more impact on our effort to respect the human rights in the future. I think that's Pak Tia.
So with that, I think it's you, Julie.
Sure. So I'm fully aligned with all the panelists. It's true that it's really a journey. L'Oréal has started, you know, this human rights due diligence journey some time ago, and it's great that now we have this mandatory human rights due diligence, as Rachel said, to level the playing field. But again, it's really a continuous effort that should be monitored all along the lines. And regarding your second question from the floor, of course, human rights are applicable to SMEs. It's really, you know, clear and stated in the UN Guiding Principles framework. But of course, it's a challenge for small and medium enterprise. That's why we need, you know, to customize a little bit the approach. So, for example, speaking about living wage, we acknowledge the fact that smaller suppliers, it will be harder for them. So we put a focus on capacity building. And not necessarily, you know, terminating the contract, but, you know, helping and co-constructing, you know, action plans and not immediately terminating the contracts. The capacity building approach is also very important.
Thank you for that, Julie. We do not have so many questions from the audience. So with that, I will give each of you, we only have 3 more speakers on our panel, 30 seconds to give your closing remarks on anything, on, you know, how to embed human rights respect within your corporations, or maybe your message to all of the your business partners in Indonesia. Please give closing remarks in 30 seconds. Maybe it will start with you, Rachel.
I think I would just, again, you know, thank you for the opportunity. And I think just to underline the fact that in order to really change the situation and once and for all to address these issues, this has to be done on a multi-stakeholder perspective. So everyone has a role. We have a lot to learn from each other, and the involvement and voices of the rights holder themselves is absolutely critical. As Julie says, we are happy and willing and want to work with our partners, with our suppliers, and with our other business partners to help build their capability and understanding. But really, this has to be a joint multi-stakeholder initiative.
Right, so maybe the next is Pak Mahmud. Silakan, Pak.
Okay, thanks, Pak Bahtiar. I think talking about respecting human rights, it's about changing the mindset first. So changing the mindset in everyone in the company is the first one that we should do. Why? Because when the mindset is changed, then they will speak about the change. There will be a change in what they speak. As soon as they speak about respect, and we expect that they can turn into action. Because if there is no action in their behavior showing that they are respecting human rights, it's useless. All the policy is useless because they don't do it. So what we are focusing on how we turn this policy into action so that it turned out to be our culture in the future. It's still a journey. I know that we need sometimes to embrace that into a culture of respecting human rights.
Thank you, Pak.
Yeah.
So Julie, you have 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I fully agree with our panelists. It's true that we are strong together, and it's also true that it's very important to have the right mindset. My point would be that it's also very important to go beyond legal compliance. You know, human rights is broad, and as it was said, it's also risks to human. So it's complex, it's broad, it's cross-cutting, it's human. So, you know, we shouldn't have a tick-the-box approach. It's really key to think outside the box.
Thank you for that, Julie. Before I let all of you go, I will just read out loud the takeaway that I have from all of the expertise and the sharing from companies. The keywords that I write down here is human rights due diligence is a must, not only for global company, but also local companies to level the playing field. It's a journey. No company is perfect, but of course, every company has to start right now. And it also involves capacity or education of suppliers, not to do punitive approach, and multi-stakeholder cooperation is needed, of course. The right mindset is needed to change the culture, not probably from CSR to respect for human rights, and companies should go beyond legal compliance. With that, I will close this session by saying thank you again for Julie, Rachel, who joined us from France and UK, and also Pak Mahmud and Pak Karyanto, who joined us from Indonesia. I hope to be able to work with you again in the future. So with that, I'll give the floor back to Ibu Gita.
Thank you so much, Pak Batiar, Julie, Rachel, Pak Mahmud, dan juga Pak Karyanto. It is so great, the perspective from business sector, and also really pleased to know about the initiative that have been taken in respecting human rights within business operation. Now, please allow me to quickly share the result of our survey. Mas Dila, mohon untuk di-share. Iya, sedikit blur ya, Mas. Bisa untuk pertanyaannya prepare. Oke. Untuk yang gendernya, kita banyak peserta perempuan hari ini, female participants. Untuk selanjutnya, Mas, hasilnya? Ya, jadi kita ada 26% yang baru pertama kali mendengar tentang human rights due diligence. Tapi kita juga ada 33% yang very familiar with human rights due diligence, and we have 41% that somehow a little bit familiar with human rights due diligence. Oke, Mas Dila, ada yang akan di-share lagi atau hanya ini? Oke, baik. Dan ada, saya lihat 43%, oh bukan dari perusahaan, baik, 27% dari perusahaan sudah merencanakan untuk melakukan uji tuntas, dan 19% belum. Jadi kita harapkan dari diskusi kita hari ini akan meningkatkan jumlahnya dari yang 19% ini, seperti tadi Pak Mahmud bilang, mengubah mindset-nya untuk lebih mengerti tentang human rights due diligence. Semoga ya Pak ya. Baik, Mas Dila, saya pikir cukup itu saja untuk pollingnya. Terima kasih. Untuk selanjutnya, saya akan mempersilahkan Bapak Profesor Makarim Wibisono, co-founder of FIRST, to deliver his closing remarks and to conclude this dialogue. Bapak Profesor Makarim, the floor is yours.
Assalamualaikum, bisa dengar ya Mbak? Bisa kita? Bisa ya?
Silakan Pak. Bisa dengan jelas.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Akhirnya kita masuk pada penghujung acara dialog pada hari ini. Saya mewakili FIRST dan UNDP kembali ingin menyampaikan terima kasih atas kesediaan Bapak, Ibu, pembicara, panelis, dan seluruh peserta yang telah meluangkan waktunya untuk mengikuti acara dialog pada sore hari ini. Kita patut memberikan apresiasi kepada panelis yang mewakili negara Prancis, Swiss, Norwegia, dan Eropa Union. Ingat, negara-negara itu telah menjadi pelopor dalam penyusunan undang-undang mandatory human rights due diligence yang dipercaya akan mengakibatkan ripple effect atau efek riat bagi penyusunan peraturan serupa di berbagai negara lain. Kami juga merasa bangga mendengar praktek yang baik, good practices, yang telah disampaikan oleh pembicara perwakilan perusahaan nasional dan global pada acara kita hari ini. Semoga inisiatif dan pencapaian yang telah dibagikan akan terus berlanjut dan menjadi inspirasi bagi perusahaan lainnya. Sebagaimana kita dengarkan pada diskusi hari ini, pelaksanaan uji tuntas hendaknya tidak dipandang sebagai beban, namun sebagai kesempatan atau opportunity. Uji tuntas HAM dipercaya akan memberikan berbagai manfaat bagi perusahaan. Seperti satu ya, mencegah terjadinya pelanggaran HAM yang lebih berat melalui identifikasi dini dampak HAM aktual dan potensial. Dua, meningkatkan kepercayaan pemangku kepentingan perusahaan seperti masyarakat, pelanggan, dan investor atas komitmen HAM perusahaan. Dan yang terakhir, memungkinkan dan membantu perusahaan nasional menjadi bagian dari rantai pasokan perusahaan global. Selain itu, pelaksanaan uji tuntas dalam waktu dekat bukan lagi menjadi satu pilihan, melainkan kewajiban bagi perusahaan yang diatur dalam peraturan perundang-undangan. Kami akan terus mendorong pelaku usaha di Indonesia dalam menerapkan penghormatan HAM melalui dialog, studi, pelatihan, maupun penyusunan panduan-panduan termasuk panduan uji tugas HAM. Selain itu, FIRST bekerjasama dengan UNDP juga akan terus membantu pemerintah dalam menyusun peraturan yang dapat
the government in drafting regulations that can accelerate and increase the adoptions of respect.
Penunjukan FIRST sebagai salah satu mitra pemerintah Indonesia dalam gugus tugas bisnis dan HAM baru-baru ini akan semakin memberikan kesempatan kepada FIRST dalam mendukung upaya pemerintah dalam memajukan bisnis dan HAM. Akhir kata, kami berharap acara dialog pada hari ini bermanfaat bagi kita semua. Sekian, sampai jumpa lagi.
Thank you, Bapak Profesor Makarim. With this, we come to the end of our dialogue. Thank you very much to all of you, to our speakers, our panelists, our participants. We hope you enjoy our dialogue today. Stay safe and healthy. Have a good evening and wonderful weekend. Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.
Thank you. Yeah.
Terima kasih.